So let's start with our introduction of such an amazingly lovely person, Dr. Rachel Grisham. And she has come from New York to be with us. And those of you that don't know about her background, I want to share some things with you. She is an associate attending in the Department of Medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering. She's an associate professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical College. She's the section head of ovarian cancer treatment and the director of gynecologic medical oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Westchester. Have you noticed a theme with these amazing people? They're leaders. You know, we're lucky that we have low-grade researchers that are really top of their game. And thank you, Dr. Grisham, that she's here when she has all these responsibilities. She's a board-certified medical oncologist, received her medical degree at Duke University School of Medicine. She performed her internal medicine internship and residency at Boston General Hospital, Massachusetts General Hospital. I was thinking of, General Hospital, that soap opera for those of you that are, I don't even know if it's on anymore. So she came to Memorial Sloan Kettering, where she served as chief fellow, again, top dog, good job, of the Hematology and Oncology Fellowship Program. Dr. Grisham joined the Gynecologic Medical Oncology Service in 2012. Her research focuses on determining the molecular drivers of low-grade serous ovarian cancer and the development of targeted treatment strategies for patients with recurrent ovarian cancer. She served as principal investigator for over 30 clinical trials, hence she's here today to talk about the perfect topic for us. And she serves on multiple committees with ASCO, NRG, and SGO. She's a graduate of the ASCO Leadership and Development Program and serves, on the GOG Partners Investigator Council, the NRG Rare Tumors Committee, and the NCCN, which we heard about yesterday with, if you remember, with Dr. Gershenson, the NCCN Ovarian Cancer Guidelines Committee, and the ASCO Annual Meeting Scientific Program Committee. She's the recipient of an ASCO Merit Award, a Conquer Cancer Career Development Award, an Ovarian Cancer Research Fund, a Liz Tiberis Award, Kaleidoscope of Hopes grant, and multiple cycle for survival grants. And there's more. Translational and Integrative Medicine Research Fund grant. Dr. Grisham, we are so pleased that you are with us today. We're thankful for you. And I'm excited for you all to get to know Dr. Grisham.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you. And we just advance with this guy right here. Oh, I got one here. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's wonderful to have a conference specifically for low-grade serous ovarian cancer, and everything looks so beautiful, and it's wonderful to have such great attendance here. So I'm here to talk about clinical trials today, and I have some slides to go over where I kind of put together the most common questions that I usually get in clinic, so we could talk through those. But really, if you have any questions as we're going through, just raise your hand, and there's a bright light right there, so if I don't see it right away, just move it around to make sure I see it, and I'll stop, because I want to discuss any questions that come up along the way. Now, I'm going to go through a lot about clinical trials, because I know we have a lot of really well-informed people here, but I want to make sure that we cover everything from the basics up to the more advanced minutiae of how clinical trials work. So please, just stop me along the way with any questions at all. And then towards the end, I'll go through some of our recent clinical trials and the clinical trials that are ongoing right now in low-grade serous ovarian cancer, and also how you find a clinical trial. These are my disclosures. Also, I will be discussing unlabeled and investigational uses of multiple different compounds. So first, we'll talk about common clinical trial questions and how clinical trials work. Then we'll talk about how do I find a clinical trial, and then examples of these current clinical trials that we have. So different types of clinical trials. So there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. And something that can be confusing when we're talking about this is that there's the phase of the study, there's the stage of the study, so there's a lot of different terms that can be used interchangeably, and so it can be confusing. But overall, generally, new compounds or new combinations of compounds will progress from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 studies. So let's talk about what those are and how these studies are run. So a phase 1 clinical trial. So when we're talking about a phase 1 study, this is generally either a new drug or a new combination of drugs. So this could be anywhere from a drug that's being tried in humans for the very first time, where all the prior data has been in animal models and cell culture models, or it can be a new combination of drugs. So oftentimes when we talk about a phase 1 clinical trial, our mind kind of jumps to that first in human scenario. But when considering a clinical trial, it's really important to talk to your doctor about how much prior data is there about this drug, because it might be a new combination of drugs that have already been used to treat other types of diseases that are now just being used together. But the main goal of a phase 1 clinical trial is to determine the correct dose and schedule of the medication, and also what the side effects of the medication are. And so a phase 1 study, usually the primary endpoint is not how well does the treatment work. It's really trying to determine, is the dose correct, is the schedule correct, and what are the side effects? And so this can occur in different ways. So sometimes phase 1 studies are dose escalation studies. When we talk about a dose escalation study, that means different groups of patients receive different doses of the drug. So a typical dose escalation study is a 3+3 design, where the first 3 patients that are enrolled to the study receive a lower dose of the drug, and then if they do not have significant side effects during their first month on treatment, then the next group of patients receives a higher dose of the drug. So it's important to know when you're talking about a phase 1 study if it's a dose escalation study, and if so, where it is in the dose and how many patients have received that dose so far. Now, phase 1 studies oftentimes have a lot of extra tests involved. Because these are new drugs or new combination of drugs, they oftentimes have multiple blood tests that happen, what we call pharmacokinetic analysis or PK analysis. A PK test is a blood test that checks to see what the level of the drug is in your blood. And so that sometimes is done before you get the drug, and then 30 minutes, an hour, 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours after the drug. Those can be long days. So it's important to know if a study has PK analysis. And then these studies will also sometimes have pharmacodynamic analysis or PD studies. And these oftentimes involve doing tumor biopsies and then looking at the actual activity of the drug on the cancer cells. So these studies are usually small studies that enroll about 15 to 30 patients. So when considering a phase 1 trial, I'd say these are the key questions to ask. Has the dose of the drug been established yet, or is it still in dose escalation? How many PK days are there, and what is the PK schedule? Because sometimes, your doctor, they're talking to you about a study, they're trying to get a lot of information conveyed at once, and they forget to tell you that there's 12-hour PK days every week on this study where you're going to have to be in clinic for 12 hours. So it's really important to know that information up front. Are there mandatory biopsies on this study? And does the sponsor of the study provide travel reimbursement? Since these phase 1 studies oftentimes have multiple study visits, sometimes the sponsor who's paying for the study will allow for travel reimbursement, where you can submit the receipts that it takes for you to drive or take the train or travel to clinic, so you can be reimbursed for that. And if they do offer that, you should definitely take advantage of that. You're already working really hard to be on a study. You should get any reimbursement that comes along with it. So once we know what the right dose of a drug is and that it's safe and what the side effects are, it can then progress to a phase 2 clinical trial. So generally, and then there's exceptions to everything I'm going to say here today, but generally in a phase 2 clinical trial, we know the right dose of a drug, and everybody on the study is receiving the same medicine. Generally, these are not randomized studies, though they can be, but usually they're not randomized. There's no placebo. Everybody's getting the same medicine And the primary endpoint of the study is to see how well does it work, how effective is it, which is what we call the efficacy of the drug. And so this type of study will look at both safety and efficacy. And these studies usually enroll about 50 to 100 patients. And sometimes these also have those PK tests or PD tests, other times they don't. So in looking at a phase 2 study, it's important to know how many patients have received the drug or drug combination before. And by the time a drug is in a phase 2 study, we should know what the side effects are. So you should ask, what are the most common side effects, like nausea, fatigue, decreased cell counts? And then you have both your common side effects and your rare but serious side effects. So each drug has its rare but serious side effects, right? Whether that be heart failure or vision problems or severe rash. So it's important both to know what the common side effects are and what the rare but serious side effects are. Again, you want to know if there's PK days, and then always good to ask if the sponsor provides travel reimbursement, because sometimes in the clinic they forget to tell you, or they don't remember that the study has that, so it's really important to ask. So once a drug has gone through phase 1 and phase 2 studies and been successful and being found to be efficacious and showing good response rates in patients, it can then progress to a phase 3 clinical trial. So obviously there's a lot of phase 1 studies, there's less phase 2 studies, and there's quite few phase 3 studies because it's harder to get to that step. So when you have a phase 3 study, this is generally what's needed for full FDA approval of a drug. And so the point of a phase 3 study is to randomize patients and to compare what our current standard of care is to the new treatment, and then follow the patients and see who does better, the patients that are getting what we currently do or the patients who are getting the new treatment. And so this is looking at primarily efficacy, but of course also safety. These studies enroll a large number of patients, usually more than 100, and it can be as many as thousands, and is generally needed for FDA approval. So, important questions to ask when considering a phase 3 study. One question is, what type of randomization does it have? So when you're randomized on a phase 3 study, it means that you consent for the study, you're found to be eligible, and then a computer system will randomly assign you to either that control arm where you receive the standard of care or the investigational arm. Now that can be a 1-to-1 randomization where it's even, or it can be other types where it's not even. Yeah, Morgan. Yeah.
And that randomization, why can't we use the current information on the general population that is receiving the standard of care outside of the trial when we're doing?
Yeah, historical control data, yeah. And so this was actually a big issue in the building of the phase 3 study, which we'll talk about later, RAMP 301, the ongoing phase 3 study in low-grade serous ovarian cancer, where the sponsor did actually push really hard for us to be able to use a historical control arm, meaning like data that had already been collected from prior studies where patients received the standard of care chemotherapy, and then use that information to compare to the investigational arm. The reason the FDA generally will not accept a historical control is because they ideally want the comparison to be in real time, right? So with the same environmental and the same available therapies in that exact time. So by definition, when you're using historical control data, those patients were treated at an earlier time, years earlier. And there might have been some differences in care at that time that led to their outcomes being different than they would be now. So generally, the FDA does require us to randomize patients in real time to that control arm. But many companies have been pushing to try to use historical data to at least augment the control arm so that you don't need to enroll as many patients to the control arm. Because we don't go on to a phase 3 study wanting to be on the control arm, right? We go on to a phase 3 study wanting to be on the investigational drug, because you can get the control arm anywhere, because that's the standard of care. which leads to the next issue, does the study allow for crossover? And so what crossover means is that if you are randomized to the control arm, the standard of care treatment, if that treatment doesn't work and the cancer progresses, do you have the opportunity to then cross over to the investigational therapy? And so that's really important, right? And that's important to know ahead of time if that's an option. Because then, ideally, if you are randomized to the control arm, you will still have the opportunity to receive the new drug, the investigational drug, if the control arm doesn't work for you. And we definitely try to advocate for our phase 3 studies to have this option. Also, there can be a high rate of dropout if there's not that option, because it's hard to ask someone to put in extra work to do these study visits and come in for the required protocol visits when they're getting a standard of care arm. It's also important to know what the potential side effects of the investigational drug and the control arm are. And when you talk about the control arm with your doctor, it's important to know ahead of time what you would receive if you were randomized to the control arm. So sometimes the control arm just has one drug on it, but usually it has multiple different options, what we call physician's choice, meaning that out of the available options, the physician and the patient decide together what they think is the best option for them in terms of standard of care. So as an example, the control arm might have an option for 3 different types of chemotherapy, or the option for chemotherapy or endocrine therapy. You would talk to your doctor first about which of those options you feel would be best for you, and then to participate in that study, you should be comfortable receiving that treatment if you are enrolled to the control arm. And then, very important question, is the study open at a location closer to my home? So phase 3 studies are oftentimes open at many different sites. Sometimes they're open at hundreds of different sites. And so you might be seeing like a second opinion in another state or another city where a doctor talks to you about a clinical trial, but that study might actually be closer at another site that's much closer to your home. So before you consent to the study, if it's not near your home, it's always good to check, is there a site closer to your home where you could enroll? Because when you're on the study, your care is the exact same no matter where you're treated. By definition, when you're on a clinical trial, your treatment needs to follow the protocol-directed therapy. So it really doesn't matter where you're receiving it. It's the exact same care anywhere. It's the same drugs. It's the same tests that are being done, and it's the same criteria determining if the drug is working or not. And it's a big hardship to travel far for your care. So if there's an option that's closer to home, that's always nice. And then just briefly, phase 4 clinical trials are something that are rarer and don't come up as often, but just to mention what a phase 4 clinical trial is. That's a trial looking at long-term safety and effectiveness of a drug that's already been FDA approved. So, oftentimes, because of all these strict criteria for clinical trials, it is somewhat of a specific subgroup of patients that are available and able to participate in a clinical trial. And so a phase 4 clinical trial is looking more at real-world experience. So this is oftentimes a more diverse population of patients receiving these drugs in the real world and looking to see how active those drugs are in a real-world population. So that one doesn't come up as much. But just about clinical trials in general, some of the common questions that oftentimes come up. One of the big questions I get is, when is the right time to think about clinical trials, early or late in the disease course? So some typical thinking people used to have is that, I should try all the standard of care regimens first, and then as a last resort, then I'll think about a clinical trial. But honestly, most of our most promising studies, like our phase 3 and phase 2 studies that are in later levels of development, have eligibility criteria which restrict the numbers of prior therapies somebody can have received. And so it's always good to be thinking about clinical trials from early on in the disease course. When somebody's had multiple lines of therapy, sometimes for certain types of clinical trials, they might not be eligible for these trials that are further on in the development process. But when you should talk to your doctor about a clinical trial is any time that a new treatment decision is being made, so at time of progression or time of diagnosis, when you're deciding what treatment to start. If you've just started a new treatment and then you go for a second opinion to talk about a clinical trial, it's not likely you'll be eligible for the clinical trial because generally for a clinical trial you need to either have a new diagnosis or have progressed on your last therapy and not started a new therapy yet. There are a lot of protections in place for women who are on clinical trials, and I'd say that my patients that are on clinical trials are watched incredibly closely. So when you're on a clinical trial, you have your regular clinical team and you have the research team. So you have an additional radiologist looking at your scans. You have an additional team looking at your safety. And so actually it can really be kind of difficult for my patients that have been on clinical trials for a long time, and then they come off and they go back to standard of care, and they really miss like that intensive nursing support that they had while they were on the clinical trial. But there are multiple different protections in place, both at the institutional level and also from our federal government, to protect women who are on clinical trials and to make sure that they are being watched very closely for safety and efficacy. So a question I get a lot from especially international patients is, will I be treated for free on a clinical trial? And then kind of the follow-up question that relates more to our domestic patients is, will my insurance cover a clinical trial? So when you're on a clinical trial, the things that are standard of care, like clinic visits and CAT scans and regular blood work, those are billed to your insurance the regular way. And then the things that are investigational, with like the study drugs and any special blood tests or biopsies that are being done specifically for the study, those are paid for by the study. And so this is important because it means that you do still need to be covered. You need to have like insurance coverage at the site where you're being treated because the clinical trial doesn't pay for everything. It only pays for the investigational components. But in general, patients' insurance covers those standard of care components the same way they would if the patient was not on a clinical trial. We always put in the consent that it's good to check with your insurance company to make sure that they'll cover the standard of care components. But I personally have never had a patient have their insurance reject them being treated on a clinical trial. But it is just important that you do have insurance coverage at the institution where you're being treated. Can you receive the study treatment with your local doctor? So there's a lot of research looking at decentralized clinical trials, the idea of being able to let someone be treated closer to home, but most clinical trials do not have that at this time. So usually you have to be treated at one of the sites that has the study open. And then in terms of how you know if the treatment is working, when people are on a clinical trial, they're generally having scans done quite frequently to look at the efficacy of the treatment every 2 to 3 months. And each of those scans is evaluated with something called RECIST criteria, which is a objective way to look at the size of any tumor lesions and whether they're getting larger or smaller. So you might have heard of RECIST criteria. So this is the imaging criteria that we use for clinical trials. And basically, this is how we define if somebody has what we call measurable disease. So when someone has recurrent cancer and they're looking for a clinical trial, many of the studies in the recurrent setting require measurable disease. And that's kind of a confusing term because, if you have something you can see on your scan, that's measurable, right? You can measure it, you can see it, or maybe your doctor even did a biopsy and showed that it had cancer cells in it. But when we talk about measurable disease, it's this specific criteria called RECIST 1.1 criteria, and it has specific definitions of what target lesions are. And so a target lesion is a tumor nodule that's at least 10 millimeters in its longest diameter, or a lymph node that's at least 15 millimeters in its shortest diameter. And you need to have at least one target lesion to have measurable disease. And so this is why sometimes people come in looking for a clinical trial and they have something we can see on a scan, but it's just not enough. It's not big enough to be a target lesion. And so you do generally need this measurable disease, and that's so that we can tell if those spots are getting bigger or smaller over time, so that you can assess if somebody is having a response or not. And then a partial response is defined as having at least a 30% reduction in your target lesions, while progression is defined as having a 20% or more increase in target lesions. A complete response, the best one, is when they disappear completely and are not visible. So the standard process for a clinical trial is that you discuss the study with your doctor, review the consent, sign the consent, and then do the screening procedures to see if you're eligible for the study. And this can involve anything from scans, labs, cardiac workup, optho workup. You also have to complete washout periods, so oftentimes you have to have been off your prior treatment for 3 or 4 weeks before starting the new study treatment. And then once your eligibility is confirmed, then you can proceed to starting treatment on the study. We always all exhale a sigh of relief when somebody comes in for cycle 1, day 1, because we've completed the eligibility, we completed the screening, everything's good, and we're ready to start. Now, depending on the study, this process of screening can take anywhere from 1 week to 6 weeks. Some studies require that the tissue be centrally assessed for different types of mutations or markers, but it depends on the individual study. I have other studies where you can put someone can sign consent and we can complete the screening quickly and start the next week. But your doctor should be able to tell you how long they expect the screening process will take, and so it's good to know that ahead of time in terms of having expectations. So how do we find where a good clinical trial is? So I think the best resource is ClinicalTrials.gov. There's definitely other resources also that can be more refined, but ClinicalTrials.gov is always kept up to date. And every clinical trial that is open in the United States is registered on ClinicalTrials.gov and most international studies also. So to go to this website, www.clinicaltrials.gov, this is the screen that comes up when I just took screenshots of it to discuss it. This is what comes up when you first go to that page. And so on this first page, you can choose your condition, you can choose the location, and you can choose the status of the studies. And so if you were looking for low-grade serous ovarian cancer, you could put that in as the disease. You could put in the location where you live or where you wish to be treated. And then under study status, you would want to choose the second choice, recruiting and not yet recruiting studies. If you go to all studies, that's also going to include every study that's been open and now closed, and that you don't really care about a closed study. So you want the studies that are open or are about to open, so studies that are enrolling patients. And so if we put in those I put in those criteria, and it showed me these 4 studies for low-grade serous ovarian cancer that are currently open in New York, where I live. So the first one that came up is the ongoing phase 3 study, the RAMP 301 study in low-grade serous ovarian cancer. The second one is a neoadjuvant study, the Chameleon study in low-grade serous ovarian cancer. The third one is the NRG study for patients with newly diagnosed low-grade serous ovarian cancer. And then this fourth one is a study that's this is the combo match study, so this is actually open in all solid tumors, but a subset of patients with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer will qualify for this based on having a RAS mutation. So they use low-grade serous as a search term for that study, so that one comes up also. And we're going to talk about all 3 of these first 3 studies. Oh, yeah.
When you say newly diagnosed,
Yeah.
how newly? I mean, have you not been on anything before?
Yeah, so it depends on the study, but we're going to talk about both of these 2 studies for newly diagnosed ovarian cancer, and they actually have different criteria, the 2 studies.
Okay.
So one of them is for patients receiving neoadjuvant therapy, so that's people that have had no prior surgery or chemo or treatment. The other study is for patients who have already undergone primary debulking surgery, but then haven't received any further treatment and then are receiving adjuvant treatment on that study. But yeah, so it depends on the individual study, but we'll talk about both of those studies for newly diagnosed.
Before we get too far, I want to get more clarity on target lesion and non-target lesion.
Sure.
And do they just follow the target, and if there's a change in the non-target, does that matter?
Yeah, great question. So yes, you follow both. You follow target and non-target. So the criteria in terms of response is based on target lesions, because on each scan, the target lesions, the diameter is added up, and then the sum of the diameters, the sum of the longest diameters is given a score, and then you're comparing that score between scans. And then you're always comparing both to the initial scan, you're comparing to the last scan, and you're comparing to the scan that was the nadir, meaning the smallest number. And so if at any time the target lesions grow by 20% from what the smallest diameter was, which could have been when you first started treatment or after you already had shrinkage from treatment, then that would be progression. So non-target lesions are other things that are not target lesions. So that can be like ascites or a thin layer of peritoneal disease that's not thick enough to be a target lesion, or it can be a new lesion that develops. And so if these non-target lesions have clear progression with a change in diameter of greater than 5 millimeters, or if there's new lesions that develop while you're on treatment, then that would be non-target progression, and that's also progression of disease.
I have a question?
Yeah.
If you could see me. So I signed consent on Wednesday for RAMP 301. But I also know it's already been sent to the FDA for fast track approval. So if
Yeah.
you're on the trial and then the drug gets approved, does the trial stop?
No, it's not going to stop, and anybody that's enrolled to the RAMP 301 study will remain on the RAMP 301 study. So Avutometinib and Defactinib have been submitted to the FDA, and it's been accepted for priority review, specifically for women with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer who have a KRAS mutation. And so that's under review right now with a PDUFA date of June 30th, meaning that by June 30th, the FDA may approve Avutometinib and Defactinib for women with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer with a KRAS mutation. So it would be for that specific subset. And so when that happens, it is likely that the study will, assuming that happens, hopefully that happens, the study will likely stop enrolling KRAS women with a KRAS mutation in the United States and continue to enroll those patients globally, since the FDA approval only applies to women in the United States. But there's several advantages, even if someone has a KRAS mutation, there's several advantages to continuing on treatment under the study, including that the study drugs are provided for free. And so I don't know how much these drugs are going to cost when they're approved. I know how much other oral cancer drugs cost, like PARP inhibitors and Lenvima, and these drugs oftentimes cost tens of thousands of dollars a month, and the whole price is not necessarily paid for by insurance. And so receiving, drug on study is definitely an advantage. But yes, those people that are enrolled to the study, they will in no way be kicked off or taken off the study or anything like that. They will continue on the study.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Grisham. This is more a comment just to let people know if you're interested in finding out the low-grade serous trials, both near where you live, but also within the States, and what's happening globally on LGSOC.org. Under resources, we have a list, and there's also information like what Dr. Grisham shared about how to search for trials yourself too.
Great, thanks, Jane. So then on ClinicalTrials.gov, it also gives you the study overview. So there's a lot of really important information on there. It gives you a brief summary of the study, and then it also gives you a detailed description. It tells you the date that the study first started, the date that the study is expected to complete accrual, the estimated enrollment to the study, and what type of study it is. So there's actually a lot of really good information on there that can help you to make a decision. And then it also has contacts and locations. So it will show you all the sites in the world that the study is open, including United States sites, the contacts, and the phone number and or email for the person at that individual site who you can contact about the study. It will also, if the study is industry sponsored, it will also oftentimes have an industry contact who you can contact with just general questions about the study. And then it also includes the eligibility criteria. And so the eligibility criteria are the criteria that you have to meet in order to go on the study, so the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. So this is a great thing to look at before you travel for consideration of a study. Because if you don't meet one of these inclusion criteria, or you have one of the exclusion criteria, the doctor is not allowed to put you on the study. You do have to meet inclusion and exclusion criteria in order to be on the study. And this is oftentimes things like measurable disease, type of cancer, pre-existing conditions, concurrent therapies, different factors that can affect whether somebody's eligible for a study. So we're talking about some of these studies right now. So what are these studies for low-grade serous ovarian cancer that we currently have open? So we currently still have no standard first-line treatment for low-grade serous ovarian cancer. Based on Dr. Gershensen's retrospective study that looked at women treated at MD Anderson Cancer Center with stage 2 to 4 low-grade serous ovarian cancer and had primary debulking surgery followed by adjuvant chemo, and then some of those patients received hormonal maintenance therapy and others did not. That study showed a significantly better progression-free survival for those women that received hormonal maintenance therapy than those that did not. And when I say hormonal maintenance therapy, that was generally an aromatase inhibitor like letrozole or anastrozole. It also included other drugs like fulvestrant or exemestane or Lupron. So based on this study, it has become a standard practice for women who've had initial surgery and chemotherapy for low-grade serous ovarian cancer to then start this maintenance hormonal therapy, or maintenance, I call it endocrine therapy because hormonal therapy sounds kind of like hormone replacement therapy, and this is really the opposite of that, but it was called hormonal maintenance therapy in this study. But that's led some to question, do you need the chemotherapy at all? Can we omit the chemotherapy and just treat our patients with the endocrine therapy? But we don't know, right? Because chemotherapy does have activity in low-grade serous ovarian cancer, and we don't want to harm our patients by omitting the chemotherapy if it's going to provide some benefit and decrease that risk of recurrence. So an ongoing study that attempts to answer this question is the NRG GY019 study. So this is a phase 3 study, so a randomized study, for women with newly diagnosed low-grade serous ovarian cancer who've had their initial debulking surgery, and so they've completed surgery, and then they go on to the study. They consent to the study, and they're randomized 1-to-1 to either carboplatin and Taxol for 6 cycles, followed by maintenance letrozole indefinitely, or no chemotherapy after surgery, and just start maintenance letrozole after surgery until either the cancer never comes back or the cancer does come back. And so this study has been going on since 2019, and it's actually expected to complete accrual this year, probably within the next 6 months. And so this will hopefully give us the answer about whether chemotherapy gives a clear benefit in the adjuvant setting or not. Now, this study is a little tricky because these are both available treatments, carbotaxol and letrozole. So in this study, you're not necessarily getting like a new drug or a drug you wouldn't have access to off of the study. And so all of our women who have volunteered to take part in this study are doing it so that they can answer this really important question for future generations. So this is an example where these women are really, putting themselves through extra work of being involved on a clinical trial so that they can answer this question for the next generation to come. Now, MEK inhibitors are something that are a really hot topic for low-grade serous ovarian cancer, right? Especially with these new drugs like Avutometinib that are hopefully coming out very soon. So there were 2 prior phase 3 studies of single-agent MEK inhibitors in low-grade serous ovarian cancer. One of them was GOG 281, which looked at a MEK inhibitor called Trametinib, and the other one was the Milo study, which looked at a MEK inhibitor called Binimetinib. These were both phase 3 randomized studies where patients were randomized to either physician's choice of therapy or the single-agent MEK inhibitor. And they showed a response rate between 13% and 26% for the single-agent MEK inhibitor. And so, those results are good. We definitely could do better. But based on those results, these single-agent MEK inhibitors were compendium listed. Nicole was talking this morning about NCCN. So the NCCN guidelines chose to compendium list both of these MEK inhibitors as an option for women with recurrent disease. But MEK inhibitors can have a lot of side effects, right? So in both of these studies, about a third of the women discontinued their MEK inhibitor due to AEs, adverse events, so due to toxicity. And so single-agent MEK inhibitors can cause, significant rash that can be cumulative, peripheral edema, GI side effects, rare but serious side effects, including ocular events and congestive heart failure. And so they have, a somewhat limited response rate and also quite a few side effects. And so one way of trying to build on the efficacy of MEK inhibitors while also improving the tolerability is to use a combination strategy that has intermittent dosing, meaning that instead of taking the MEK inhibitor every single day like you do with binimetinib or trametinib, you instead take it intermittently. So avutometinib is a first-in-class RAF/MEK clamp, which is a pill, an oral therapy, that acts on the MAP kinase pathway. And defactinib is also a pill, an oral therapy, in this case a FAK inhibitor that helps to mediate drug resistance. So the combination of avutometinib and defactinib is taken with intermittent dosing. It's taken on a 4-week cycle, a 4-week schedule, and out of those 4 weeks, the defactinib is taken twice a day, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and the avutometinib, the RAF/MEK clamp, is taken twice a week, 3 weeks on and 1 week off. So you're taking your MEK/RAF inhibitor just twice a week for 3 weeks out of every 4 weeks. And by having that off week each cycle, it can help to mitigate some of that toxicity. Now, these drugs certainly have their own side effects too. They can cause rash, GI side effects, fatigue, risk of ocular side effects. But oftentimes, the cumulative side effects may not necessarily be as bad as if the drug was taken continuously. So this combination of drugs was studied in a phase 1 study that looked at multiple different solid tumor types, including low-grade serous ovarian cancer. And that study showed really high response rate in those patients with low-grade serous ovarian cancer and led to FDA breakthrough therapy designation for this combination, which is a designation that allows for the drugs to have some special leeway to be studied in a more quick and efficient way. And so that led to the phase 2 study, the RAMP 201 study. And so the RAMP 201 study enrolled women with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer who had measurable disease by that RECIST 1.1 criteria and had received at least one prior line of chemotherapy. And women who enrolled to that study were initially randomized to the avutometinib and the defactinib versus avutometinib alone in order to determine if the combination was more efficacious than just getting avutometinib by itself. And then based on an interim analysis, it was found that the combination was more effective. And then in the expansion phase, all women received the combination. And then there was also a Part D cohort where patients received a lower dose of the avutometinib in order to determine the dose optimization of the drug. And so this study completed accrual in February of 2024. And we now have some follow-up data from this study which showed that the majority of patients had reduction in their target lesions on this study. And so the overall response rate for the study in parts A, B, and C was 31%, with a 44% response rate in those patients who had a KRAS mutation, and a 17% response rate in those patients that did not have a KRAS mutation. So the response rate was higher in those patients with a KRAS mutation, but there's some other factors that go into this. So patients that have a KRAS mutation tend to have higher response rates to all treatments. It's a prognostic indicator. And so this combination may still be more effective than standard of care treatment in the KRAS wild type population. But in order to say that for sure, we need to look at that in a randomized fashion, or the FDA says we need to look at that in a randomized fashion. And so there's an ongoing phase 3 study that continues to randomize women with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer who have a KRAS mutation or not to this treatment versus standard of care treatment. But as was mentioned, based on these results showing a really good response rate and also really meaningful responses with a median duration of response of 31.1 months, meaning that patients that responded for a really long time to this treatment. This accelerated review is happening to determine if these drugs can be FDA approved shortly for those patients with recurrent disease who do have a KRAS mutation. But only about a third of women with recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer will have a KRAS mutation, and so we need more effective treatments for all of our women with low-grade serous ovarian cancer, not just those with a KRAS mutation. So the phase 3 study continues to enroll patients. This is called the RAMP 301 study, and this is for women who have either a KRAS mutation or do not have a KRAS mutation. And similarly, they are randomized to the Avutometinib and Defactinib, or the physician's choice of therapy. And this study does have crossover, meaning that women who are randomized to the physician's choice of treatment, like chemotherapy or endocrine treatment, if that treatment stops working and they develop progression, they then have the opportunity to screen to cross over to the Avutometinib and Defactinib. And the primary endpoint of this study is progression-free survival. So any other questions about RAMP 201 and RAMP 301? I know we had some really good questions about this earlier. Yeah.
If the phase 3 shows to be very successful for low grade in general, will there ever come a time where that would be the primary care, or does it always stay in the recurrent status?
Yeah,
when
great
does
question.
something move from, okay,
Yeah.
all you people that are on letrozole, this is a better alternative, even if it hasn't recurred?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm going to talk about that next, because it's a very good question. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I just have a couple of questions. If this got approved in June, how soon would the drugs be available?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't know yet.
Okay.
Usually there's a little bit of time for the pharmacies to get the drug to get on formulary at different institutions. But I can tell you that a drug company is very motivated to try to have their drugs ready and available at the time of approval, because they don't want people to become frustrated or get the idea that, oh, these drugs are hard to get. And so, it's generally the intention of a company that the drugs be available immediately once approved. And I think that's what they're actively working towards.
Okay.
And oftentimes, in the oncology community, I would say in general, when a new drug is approved, oftentimes it's kind of like out at the more academic centers a little faster because they have quicker formulary updates. But I'd say within usually 3 to a maximum of 6 months, it's usually readily available once a new drug is approved.
Okay. And a second question, if someone was on the phase 2 RAMP trial, like myself, and the side effects were pretty significant, if this was approved, would that be another treatment choice for me to go back on these 2 drugs? And a follow-up to that is, could dosage be reduced?
Yeah. So, both on these studies and in real life, both of these drugs have dose reductions. So Avutometinib starts at 3.2. I don't like to ask people personal questions about themselves in front of an audience, but were you on the single agent or the combination? Combination, okay. So that's a 3.2 milligram starting dose. So that can go down to 2.4, and there is actually a 1.6 dose now also, which was not at the time of the RAMP 201 study. And so it does have potential dose reductions. Defactinib also has a dose reduction. Instead of being 200 milligrams twice a day, it can be 200 milligrams once a day. So generally, once a drug is approved, it's being given by prescription. And so as long as somebody meets the criteria for the drug, their doctor can prescribe it. Now, this drug, the application is for patients with a KRAS mutation. And so I just say that because in terms of off-label use, generally with these oncology drugs, insurance does check to make sure that somebody meets the label indication. For example, like with PARP inhibitors, olaparib as a single agent is FDA approved only for people with a BRCA mutation, not for people that are HRD positive. And so generally when there's a biomarker that's part of the label, somebody must have that biomarker in general for their insurance to approve it. But yes, so once a drug is approved, it can be given by prescription by any qualified oncologist to anybody that meets the label indications for that drug.
Yeah, and I think we kind of touched on it. I was going to ask I know some of the drugs we have now, as side effects get worse versus stopping. Verzenio is a prime one where you drop it down. And so it sounds like this has the same potential to make it more tolerable, or if side effects get bad, it could be staggered down in dosage so that it's...
Yes, it can have dose reductions. In general, it's usually better to start at the full dose of a medication. In some practices, people at lower doses and then increase them. I'd say, for many of our oncology drugs, I would prefer the approach of starting at the full dose and then dose reducing if needed. But yes, there are dose reductions of both drugs.
And in comparison to others like letrozole and so forth, are the side effects looking to be more tolerable, or?
Yeah, so, with MEK inhibitors in general, unlike chemotherapy, usually within the first couple months of treatment, people get most of the side effects that they're going to get. Unlike chemo, where we have those cumulative side effects that build up over time, like neuropathy and and decreased cell counts and things like that. So usually if people develop the rash and the edema, if they're going to have the edema during the first 2 cycles.
Okay.
And then oftentimes for my patients that have been on treatment for long term, because I have patients that have been on these drugs in various clinical trials for years, in my experience, oftentimes the side effects do become more tolerable over time.
Okay. So Mechanis was kind of the exact opposite. You started well on the Tremenative, and it got much worse as time went on with the skin lesions and so forth.
And I think that's partly because of the continuous dosing. And I think here with the intermittent dosing, because you have that recovery week, and also you're only taking it 2 times a week, and so the side effects don't tend to pile up as much. Because, in my experience with single-agent MEK inhibitor, just the rash never gets a break, and so it just keeps piling up a lot of the time.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Nicole, is it okay if I go over a little bit? Thank you.
Doctor, for the RAMP trial, it's like one drug is like still MEK inhibitor, right? The other drug try to fix the drug resistant problem for MEK inhibitor, right? So how long the MEK inhibitor will break through the drug resistance?
So, so people oftentimes ask, and that's why in the first component of the RAMP 201 study, it was randomized to the single agent Avutometinib versus the combination, because we think of the MEK-RAF inhibitor as being the more active component there. But there was actually a significantly higher response rate with the combination than with Avutometinib alone. So I think the Defactinib is definitely adding to the activity there. And, and we hypothesize that it's inhibiting the development of drug resistance. And I think, a good sign of that is that the median of duration of response thus far has been incredibly long on this study. So a median duration of response of 31.1 months is like crazy good. Like we almost never see that in clinical trials. Now this study is still ongoing and that number could change over time, but that means that patients are staying on this treatment for a really long time. And we don't know yet because people are still on treatment. There's still people on 201. There's still people on the FRAME study, the phase 1 study of these drugs. And so over time we'll get more information about how long people stay on these drugs. But hopefully, it's our hope that they'll be on them for years and years and years. I actually treated one of the first women with a single-agent MEK inhibitor, an older one, Avutometinib, years ago, in 2009, with a single-agent MEK inhibitor who had recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer. She was treated on the Avutometinib GOG study. And she had a complete response, and she's been on treatment this whole time. She's still on it. It's been, it's been 15 years. She's still on that treatment. And so, as long as the treatment's working, you just stay on it.
Okay, that's just one person, right, in your practice?
That's one person, because we only treated like 3 people on that. I mean, that was a small study that only had like 40 patients on it. But we can't say that about these drugs because these studies have only been going on for a few years.
Okay.
So I don't know if we'll have people on it for longer or not.
Okay, thank you.
But I hope so. Yeah.
I know that there is an oddity with folks that are estrogen receptive negative. I know that we are a very, very small number. Is there anything on the horizon in terms of studies for people like that?
Well, so MEK inhibitor, RAF inhibitor, and FAK inhibitor, they don't work through the ER pathway at all. So those would be regardless of someone's ER status.
So I have a question too.
Yeah.
So on the trial, so they've got their the Avutometinib is 3.2 milligram now.
Yes.
So how do they know, when people get dosed down, what is the rate of not having advancement?
Yeah.
Because I know in the 201, because I'm 201, that it started off with 5, and then it was
so
down
in the
to
single
4.
agent arm, Avutometinib was 4 in the single agent arm.
I started with 5 pills.
The pills are 0.8 milligrams
Right,
each.
okay.
Yeah. So 4 milligrams
so
total.
as you dose down, depending on tolerance, and as this changes, how do you know as you're dosing down, you're dosing down because of maybe side effects, but do they have data that shows what's the success rate of it continuing? What are you giving up by dosing down?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I recommend that people generally start a treatment at the approved dose, the recommended starting dose, as opposed to starting at a lower dose. Because when people start at a lower dose, sometimes they never get up to the full dose, even though they might have tolerated it, right? So in the 201 study, in the initial component, patients were randomized to the 3.2 milligram dose of Avutometinib with Defactinib versus 4 milligrams of Avutometinib as a single agent. The response rate was higher with the 3.2 milligrams given with Defactinib. And then there was a Part D component for dose optimization where the lower dose of Avutometinib, the 1.6 milligram dose, was used, and the efficacy was lower there. And so it, as one might expect, at lower doses, a drug does not work as well. And so if you're able to tolerate it at the recommended dose, it's generally better to continue at that dose and to only dose reduce if needed for toxicity. Now, it didn't not work at the lower dose, but it was less efficacious. And so, the best way to get generally the most efficacious dose is to be at the full dose. But that's not possible for everybody. People's bodies metabolize drugs differently.
Right, people have to sometimes dose down.
So sometimes you need a dose reduction. Yeah.
Okay.
I may have misunderstood, but when this drug combo becomes available, if you don't have the KRAS mutation, will you not be eligible for it?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Currently. But it is the goal of the phase 3, so that's for the accelerated approval based on the phase 2 study. The phase 3 study is currently enrolling patients, and the goal of the phase 3 study is to have these drugs approved for everybody. But in order to show the efficacy in the KRAS wild-type patients, it needs to be compared to a control population. And so the statistical analysis of the phase 3 study is to look first at the primary endpoint in patients that have a KRAS mutation, and then to look at the entire population, with the goal of hopefully having, at the time of analysis of the phase 3 study, the combination approved for everybody, regardless of KRAS mutation status. But yes, the current, the current indication that's currently under review with the FDA based on the phase 2 study is just for patients who have a KRAS mutation in their tumor. That's why it's very important that we complete the phase 3 study, because that is our way to get these drugs hopefully approved for everybody, since the FDA has decided they need that comparator arm to make that decision. Okay, so for our friend who had the neoadjuvant question, forget who that was. So that's a very good point because, right, yeah, so traditionally, and just generally, we always have to use our new drugs in the recurrent setting. That's how new drugs are developed. But if a drug is looking really active, we want to get that to the upfront setting as quickly as possible, right? We don't want patients to have to wait until their cancer has recurred in order to receive our most active drugs. And so that's why we developed the Chameleon study, which is currently open at Sloan Kettering. And so this is trying to bring these drugs to the forefront, even though they're not FDA approved in the recurrent setting yet. We want to be doing these studies as quickly as possible to try to see if this is a better option for women with newly diagnosed disease. And then there is an initiative through the FDA called Project Frontrunner, which the idea is to bring effective treatments forward more quickly. And so this is a study that we developed for women with newly diagnosed advanced low-grade serous ovarian cancer. So people that are either not appropriate for primary debulking surgery, meaning they have too extensive of disease to have surgery when they're first diagnosed. Traditionally, those people would be treated with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Or they've had their primary debulking surgery and they had a suboptimal debulking and have residual disease that you can measure, RECIST measurable disease. And so on this study, women are being treated with both these drugs, the Avutometinib and Defactinib, at those standard doses that we discussed, in combination with letrozole, and if they still have active ovaries in place, Lupron as well. And so the idea is to see if we can shrink down their cancer at the forefront and then make them eligible for surgery and then continue on these treatments in the maintenance setting. And so women that enroll to this study either receive this treatment first and then hopefully go to surgery and then receive it as a maintenance treatment, or if they've had surgery and have suboptimal debulking, then receive this treatment as a maintenance treatment. And so this is a small study. It's a niche population, and so it's enrolled like 4 patients so far. But it's a very exciting study to be bringing these drugs to the forefront so quickly. And so this study so it's currently only available at Sloan Kettering, but we're opening it in Atlanta at Emory, and then probably soon we'll open it with my friend Katie Moore in Oklahoma also. But I think that this would be very exciting to try to be bringing these drugs to the forefront because, yes, I know carbo, Taxol, and letrozole, not the most exciting options. And so it would be great if we could bring these active drugs to the forefront. And then just general clinical trial considerations. These are the specific low-grade serous ovarian cancer studies, but oftentimes there's epithelial ovarian cancer studies that patients with low-grade serous ovarian cancer may be eligible. So it doesn't always have to be a study specifically for low-grade serous ovarian cancer. It can be an ovarian cancer study or a phase 1 study that's biomarker-directed, such as a study for patients with a KRAS mutation, a RAF mutation, and an F1 mutation, et cetera. And then it's always important to discuss clinical trials before you start your next line of therapy. So thank you for all these excellent questions about clinical trials. Before I step down, I just wanted to see if there were any other questions because there were so many good questions here. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about funding. So,
yeah.
Do you foresee any issues with the funding being kind of put toward cancer and research in general?
Yeah, many of our clinical trials in oncology are industry funded. So like the RAMP 301 study, the RAMP 201 study, the Chameleon study, these studies are funded by the drug company, and so we're not dependent on government funds for those. So I think for much of clinical trial development, it hopefully will not come into effect. And luckily, cancer research is generally a bipartisan issue. It's hard to hate too much on cancer patients, I would hope. But, I think it's probably more of a consideration for preclinical research funding. And oftentimes, for these drugs to be developed, it comes from innovation that's happening in the laboratory. And that can be harder to have industry funding for. And we oftentimes are dependent on government funds in the form of K grants and R01 grants in order to support that early preclinical work that's done like kind of 15 years before a new drug is developed. And so I don't think it will affect our clinical trials or available therapies right now, but it could potentially affect opportunities for slowing innovation in drug development for 5-10 years from now by pushing back on that initial development. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. You are certainly one of our superstars, and I just feel honored to be in your presence because you're really moving the needle for us, and that's a really big deal. Thank you so much. I've participated in 3 trials, 0281, and then RAMP 201. And my question is more about trial design, and I wonder why more trials are not don't include the crossover component, because it just seems like a really kind thing to do for patients who are randomized to standard of care, and that you might actually get more people participating with that crossover component.
Yeah. So the reason is because the standard of care for FDA approval, for approval of a cancer drug, is improvement in overall survival, OS. And so, if both arms receive the drug, then that can dilute out your overall survival advantage. But in a drug like low-grade serous ovarian cancer, where luckily our patients live a long time, we would expect that both arms would, if the drugs are approved, that people enrolled to both arms, even if we hadn't had crossover, would have eventually all been treated with the drugs since they're effective. And therefore, we were able to rationalize it with the agency that it was reasonable to have crossover. But the reason that drug companies are sometimes resistant to allow for crossover is because of that endpoint and that the FDA will look at the overall survival data between the two arms. And there's different issues that can dilute that and such. But us as investigators and for our patients, yes, I always want crossover because nobody goes on wanting to be on the control arm. They want and they're doing a lot of work to be on that study. You want them to get the new drugs. And so, I definitely advocated and pushed for it in the 301 study, and I'm very glad that we have it in the 301 study. I think it's in the best interest of our patients to have it.